The American family is about to face a financial reckoning that few saw coming and even fewer understand. In living rooms across the nation, from Seattle to Miami, from Detroit to San Diego, families are about to discover that the price of their morning routine, their children's clothes, their heating bills, and even their weekend barbecues is about to climb in ways that will fundamentally reshape their household budgets. This isn't speculation. This isn't political hyperbole. This is the cold, calculated reality of what happens when the world's largest trading relationship becomes collateral damage in a high-stakes game of economic chess. President Donald Trump's sweeping tariff proposals targeting Canadian imports represent more than just another headline in an already turbulent news cycle. They represent a seismic shift in North American trade policy that economists warn could cost the average American family $1,300 annually. $1,300. For context, that's roughly equivalent to a month's worth of groceries for a family of four. That's a mortgage payment for many Americans. That's the difference between making ends meet and spiraling into debt for millions of households already walking the tightrope of financial stability in an era of persistent inflation and economic uncertainty. But how did we get here? How did the relationship between two nations that share the world's longest undefended border, that have built one of the most integrated economies in human history, arrive at this moment of potential economic rupture? To understand the gravity of what's unfolding, we need to step back and examine the intricate web of trade, dependency, and mutual prosperity that has defined the United States and Canada for generations. Canada and the United States don't just trade with each other. They are economically intertwined in ways that make the very concept of separate economies almost quaint. Every single day, nearly $2 billion worth of goods and services crosses the border between these two nations. That's not annually, that's daily. The scale is staggering. Canadian lumber builds American homes. Canadian energy powers American cities. Canadian aluminum forms the backbone of American manufacturing. Canadian pharmaceuticals keep Americans healthy. And in return, American technology, American agriculture, American manufactured goods, and American services flow northward in a relationship so balanced, so mutually beneficial, that trade experts have long held it up as the gold standard of international commerce. Consider for a moment the physical infrastructure that supports this relationship. There are 48 land border crossings between the United States and Canada where commercial traffic flows. The Ambassador Bridge connecting Detroit and Windsor handles more than 25% of all trade between the two countries. On any given day, thousands of trucks loaded with goods ranging from automotive parts to fresh produce to electronics make the crossing. Supply chains that power American factories depend on components that might cross that border multiple times during the manufacturing process. A single automobile assembled in Michigan might contain parts that traveled back and forth across the Canadian border 6 or 7 times before the finished vehicle rolls off the assembly line. This integration didn't happen by accident. It is the result of decades of careful policy coordination, starting with the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement in 1988, evolving into the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994, and most recently updated as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement in 2020. These weren't just trade deals. They were recognition of a fundamental economic reality, that the prosperity of both nations is inextricably linked, that barriers between them harm both sides, and that cooperation yields dividends that protectionism simply cannot match. Enter the tariff proposals. The Trump administration has floated various schemes, but the core concept remains consistent: impose substantial tariffs on Canadian imports to, in the administration's words, protect American industries and workers. The stated targets vary depending on which policy paper or presidential statement you consult. Sometimes it's steel and aluminum, sometimes it's lumber, sometimes it's agricultural products. But the underlying philosophy is unwavering, that Canada has been taking advantage of the United States, that American workers have been left behind by unfair trade practices, and that only aggressive tariff action can level the playing field. The problem with this narrative is that it fundamentally misunderstands how modern trade actually works. When the administration talks about protecting American steel workers by imposing tariffs on Canadian steel, it sounds straightforward. It sounds patriotic. It sounds like common sense. But the reality is devastatingly more complex. That Canadian steel doesn't just compete with American steel. It is American steel, in the sense that American manufacturers depend on it to produce finished goods. American automakers need Canadian steel and aluminum to build cars. American construction companies need Canadian lumber to frame houses. American pharmaceutical companies need Canadian ingredients to manufacture medications. American consumers need Canadian energy to heat their homes and power their businesses. The economists who have studied Trump's tariff proposals have reached a near unanimous conclusion, one that should alarm every American family. Tariffs are taxes, and these taxes will be paid primarily by American consumers. When the federal government imposes a 25% tariff on Canadian lumber, the Canadian Lumber Company doesn't write a check to the U.S. Treasury. Instead, the American company importing that lumber pays the tariff and then inevitably, predictably, passes that cost along to consumers. The home builder buying that lumber pays more. The family buying that home pays more. The cycle repeats across industry after industry, product after product, transaction after transaction, until the accumulated weight of these costs settles firmly on the shoulders of ordinary Americans. The $1,300 figure that economists have calculated isn't pulled from thin air. It's based on careful analysis of trade flows, price elasticities, and consumption patterns. Research from the Tax Foundation, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and Yale University's Budget Lab has converged on similar estimates. They've looked at what American families actually buy, where those products come from, how much of those products originate in Canada, and what happens to prices when tariffs are imposed. The math is sobering. A family that heats their home with natural gas will pay more because Canada supplies a significant portion of American natural gas imports. A family buying a new car will pay more because Canadian auto parts are integral to vehicles assembled in the United States. A family renovating their home will pay more because Canadian lumber and building materials are essential to American construction. A family buying groceries will pay more because Canadian agricultural products from beef to wheat to vegetables are staples of the American diet. Let's break down what $1,300 actually means in the context of a family budget. For the median American household earning around $75,000 annually, $1,300 represents nearly 2% of their total income. For lower income families, the impact is proportionally much larger. A family earning $30,000 a year losing $1,300 to tariffs is losing more than 4% of their income. These aren't abstract statistics. These are real families making real choices between paying the higher price for heating their home in winter or cutting back on other necessities. These are families choosing between the higher cost of groceries or reducing the quality and quantity of food on their table. These are families facing the choice between the increased cost of transportation or limiting their mobility and opportunities. The cruelty of tariffs is that they are regressive. They hurt the poor more than the rich. A wealthy family spending an extra $1,300 on goods and services over the course of a year barely notices the difference. A working-class family on a tight budget notices every single dollar. They notice when the cost of filling up their gas tank goes up. They notice when their electricity bill climbs. They notice when the price of children's clothing increases. They notice and they adjust by doing without, by cutting corners, by sacrificing quality of life in ways that compound over time. But the economic pain doesn't stop at consumer prices. The tariff shock would reverberate through the American economy in ways that threaten jobs, reduce investment, and undermine the very industries the administration claims to be protecting. Consider the automotive sector, one of the crown jewels of American manufacturing. The automobile industry in the United States is not a purely American enterprise. It is a North American enterprise. Components and materials flow seamlessly across borders as part of integrated supply chains. Canadian-made parts go into American-assembled vehicles. American-made components go into Canadian-assembled vehicles. The final products are sold throughout North America and exported globally. This integration has made the North American auto industry one of the most competitive in the world. Impose significant tariffs on Canadian automotive components, and what happens? American automakers face a choice: absorb the higher costs and reduce profitability, potentially leading to layoffs and reduced investment, or pass the cost to consumers and watch sales decline as vehicles become less affordable. Either option is bad. Either option leads to job losses. The very American workers the tariffs are supposedly protecting end up hurt. The Center for Automotive Research has estimated that broad-based tariffs on automotive imports, including those from Canada, could cost American automakers billions in additional expenses and put tens of thousands of American jobs at risk. This isn't theoretical. We've seen this movie before. During the first Trump administration, tariffs on steel and aluminum were imposed with similar rhetoric about protecting American workers. What actually happened? American steel and aluminum producers saw short-term gains. But American manufacturers who use steel and aluminum as inputs, companies in sectors ranging from automotive to construction to consumer goods, saw their costs spike. Some companies laid off workers. Some canceled expansion plans. Some moved operations overseas. A study by the Federal Reserve found that the tariffs actually resulted in a net loss of manufacturing jobs because the number of jobs lost in downstream industries exceeded the number of jobs saved in steel and aluminum production. The tariffs intended to protect American workers ended up costing American workers their livelihoods. Canada, for its part, has made clear that it will not sit idly by if subjected to sweeping American tariffs. The Canadian government has already begun preparing retaliatory measures, tariffs on American goods designed to inflict maximum political pain. The Canadian playbook is well established. Target products from politically sensitive regions, impose tariffs on agricultural products from red states, hit manufactured goods from swing states, make sure that the economic pain is felt precisely where it will generate the most political pressure on the American administration. This isn't just hardball politics. This is how trade wars escalate. This is how a dispute over one sector metastasizes into a full-blown economic conflict that harms industries far removed from the original disagreement. Imagine the American farmer in Wisconsin who suddenly can't sell dairy products to Canada because retaliatory tariffs have made them uncompetitive. Imagine the bourbon distiller in Kentucky watching exports to Canada collapse. Imagine the aerospace worker in Washington state whose company loses Canadian contracts. These are the collateral casualties of trade wars. These are the Americans who did nothing wrong, who produce high-quality products, who work hard and play by the rules, and who suddenly find their livelihoods threatened because of policy decisions made in Washington. The White House's argument for tariffs rests on a flawed premise that trade is a zero-sum game where one country's gain is another country's loss. This mercantilism harks back to economic thinking from centuries ago, thinking that has been thoroughly debunked by both economic theory and empirical evidence. Modern trade is not about winners and losers. It's about comparative advantage, specialization, and mutual gains from exchange. Canada produces certain goods more efficiently than the United States. The United States produces certain goods more efficiently than Canada. By trading, both countries end up with more goods, better goods, and lower prices than if each tried to produce everything domestically. This isn't controversial. This is Economics 101. This is the foundation of prosperity in the modern global economy. But economics and politics don't always align. The political appeal of tariffs is undeniable. They offer a simple narrative. Foreign countries are taking advantage of us, and we're going to fight back. They offer a visible enemy and a decisive action. They resonate with workers in industries that have indeed faced challenges, workers who have seen factories close and jobs disappear and communities hollowed out. The fact that tariffs aren't actually the solution, that they often make problems worse rather than better, gets lost in the emotional appeal of the message. The truth about manufacturing job losses in the United States is more complex and less amenable to simple tariff solutions. Yes, some jobs have been lost to international trade, but far more have been lost to automation, to technological change, to shifts in consumer preferences, to productivity improvements. A modern automobile factory produces far more cars with far fewer workers than a factory from 30 or 40 years ago. That's not because of trade with Canada. That's because of robots, advanced manufacturing techniques, and efficiency gains. Tariffs won't bring back jobs that were eliminated by robots. Tariffs won't reverse technological progress. Tariffs will, however, make American companies less competitive globally, reduce their ability to invest in innovation, and ultimately put more jobs at risk. There's also a geopolitical dimension to this conflict that cannot be ignored. Canada is not just a trading partner. Canada is a military ally, a member of NATO, a partner in continental defense through NORAD, a country that has fought alongside American soldiers in conflicts from World War I to Afghanistan. The relationship between the United States and Canada is founded on more than commerce. It's founded on shared values, shared history, shared sacrifice. To treat Canada as an economic adversary, to impose punitive tariffs as if Canada were a hostile power, is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the relationship and the strategic importance of maintaining strong ties with America's closest neighbor. In a world where the United States faces genuine strategic competitors, where China's economic and military power continues to grow, where global supply chains are increasingly vulnerable to disruption, where energy security and resource security are paramount, alienating Canada makes no strategic sense. Canada is one of the world's largest producers of critical minerals essential for everything from batteries to semiconductors. Canada is a stable, reliable source of energy in a volatile global market. Canada is a partner in securing the Arctic as climate change opens new shipping routes and increases geopolitical competition in the far north. Undermining this partnership over tariffs that will primarily harm American families is a strategic blunder of the first order. The dairy industry provides a particularly illustrative case study of the complexity and futility of tariff-driven trade disputes. The United States has long complained about Canada's supply management system for dairy, arguing that it unfairly restricts American dairy exports to Canada. There's some merit to this complaint. Canada's system does protect Canadian dairy farmers from international competition, but the United States itself provides enormous subsidies to its dairy industry, subsidies that give American dairy farmers competitive advantages. Both countries protect their dairy sectors, just through different mechanisms. The sensible approach would be negotiated reforms that open both markets gradually while supporting affected farmers through the transition. The tariff approach is to escalate the conflict, harm consumers on both sides of the border, and solve nothing. What makes the current tariff threat particularly frustrating for those who understand trade policy is that there are legitimate issues in the U.S.-Canada trade relationship that deserve attention. There are regulatory differences that create unnecessary barriers to commerce. There are disputes over specific products and sectors that could be resolved through negotiation. The USMCA agreement itself includes mechanisms for addressing trade grievances, dispute resolution processes that both countries agreed to use. Resorting to unilateral tariffs instead of using these agreed-upon processes undermines the rules-based trading system that has served American interests well for decades. The timing of these tariff threats is also worth examining. They come at a moment when the American economy, while showing strength in some indicators, faces genuine challenges. Inflation, while down from its peak, remains a concern for American families. Interest rates are elevated, making borrowing more expensive for both consumers and businesses. The national debt continues to climb. In this environment, policies that will increase consumer prices and potentially trigger a trade war with one of America's largest trading partners seem particularly ill-advised. The Federal Reserve has been working to cool inflation without triggering a recession, a delicate balancing act. Tariff-driven price increases would make that task significantly harder, potentially forcing the Fed to keep interest rates higher for longer, which would increase the risk of an economic downturn. Small businesses, often overlooked in these debates, would be particularly vulnerable to the tariff shock. A small construction company operating on tight margins can't easily absorb a 25% increase in the cost of lumber. A small manufacturer relying on Canadian components can't simply switch suppliers without incurring significant costs and delays. A small restaurant buying Canadian beef or produce can't pass all the additional costs to customers without risking losing business to competitors. Small businesses are the backbone of the American economy, responsible for roughly half of all private sector employment. Policies that squeeze small businesses, that make it harder for them to compete and grow, ultimately harm American workers and communities. The environmental implications of disrupting U.S.-Canada trade also deserve consideration. Canada and the United States have worked together on environmental protection, on managing shared resources like the Great Lakes, on addressing climate change. Canada's hydroelectric power exports to the United States provide clean energy that helps American states meet renewable energy goals and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Tariffs that disrupt energy trade could perversely lead to increased use of fossil fuels as American utilities scramble to replace Canadian hydroelectricity with domestic sources that may be more carbon intensive. Trade policy and environmental policy are connected in ways that aren't always obvious but are nonetheless real and important. For American consumers, the $1,300 tariff shock would manifest in countless small ways that accumulate into a significant burden. The extra $5 when you fill up your gas tank. The extra $10 when you buy a winter coat. The extra $20 on your monthly heating bill. The extra $50 when you buy groceries for the week. The extra $100 when you purchase furniture. None of these individual increases seems catastrophic in isolation, but they add up. Over the course of a year, they add up to $1,300 or more, money that comes out of family budgets that for many Americans have no slack, no room for unexpected expenses. The political calculation behind the tariff proposals seems to be that the benefits will be visible and concentrated, while the costs will be diffuse and easy to blame on other factors. Saving jobs at a steel mill makes for good photo opportunities and compelling political messaging. The job losses at companies that use steel, the higher prices consumers pay, the reduced economic growth, these are harder to see and easier to attribute to other causes. But economists aren't fooled. The data is clear. The costs of tariffs exceed the benefits. The jobs lost exceed the jobs saved. The harm to consumers exceeds the gains to protected industries. Canada has options beyond simply accepting American tariffs. Canada can and likely will seek to strengthen trade relationships with other countries. The European Union, Japan, and other major economies would welcome increased Canadian trade as American trade becomes more uncertain. Canada can accelerate its own efforts to diversify its economy and reduce dependence on the American market. Over time, this reorientation would mean fewer opportunities for American businesses, less influence for American policy preferences, and a weaker overall relationship. The United States benefits enormously from having Canada as a close trading partner. Making that partnership more difficult serves no American interest. The voices calling for caution on tariffs span the political spectrum and the economic landscape. Business groups from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to the National Association of Manufacturers have warned against broad-based tariffs. Conservative and libertarian think tanks have issued studies documenting the economic harm. Even some voices within the Republican Party, traditionally more sympathetic to tariffs than Democrats in recent years, have expressed concern about the consumer price impacts. But whether these voices of caution will penetrate the political calculation remains to be seen. What happens if the tariffs are imposed? The immediate impact would be disruption as companies scramble to adjust to the new reality. Some would seek exemptions, petitioning the government for relief from the tariffs. The exemption process itself would become a source of lobbying, favoritism, and potential corruption as companies with political connections might receive favorable treatment. Other companies would try to shift supply chains, seeking alternative sources for products previously purchased from Canada. This process takes time, costs money, and often results in higher prices or lower quality because the Canadian source was chosen for good economic reasons in the first place. Still, other companies would simply pass the costs to consumers and hope that their competitors face the same constraints so that relative market positions don't change even as absolute prices rise. Over the medium term, the economic modeling suggests several likely outcomes, none of them positive for American families. Consumer prices would rise by the amount of the tariffs plus any additional markups as products move through the supply chain. Economic growth would slow as higher prices reduce real incomes and purchasing power. Some job losses would occur in industries dependent on Canadian inputs. Investment would decline as businesses face greater uncertainty and higher costs. The federal budget deficit would worsen as tariff revenues, never as large as proponents suggest, fail to offset the reduced tax revenues from slower economic growth. The trade deficit, which tariff advocates claim to care about, would likely not improve significantly because tariffs don't address the underlying factors that drive trade imbalances, factors like savings rates, investment rates, and macroeconomic policy. The historical record on tariffs is not encouraging. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, passed in the early years of the Great Depression, raised tariffs on thousands of imported goods. The stated goal was to protect American farmers and manufacturers. The actual result was retaliation from other countries, a collapse in international trade, and a deepening of the global economic crisis. Economists have debated the precise contribution of Smoot-Hawley to the Depression's severity, but there's broad consensus that it made things worse, not better. More recently, the tariffs imposed during the first Trump administration provide a cautionary tale. The cost to consumers exceeded the benefits to protected industries. Job losses in downstream sectors offset job gains in protected sectors. Farmers had to be bailed out with billions in subsidies as agricultural exports collapsed due to retaliation. The promised renaissance of American manufacturing never materialized. Yet here we are again, facing the prospect of an even more aggressive tariff regime, one that would target one of America's closest allies and most important trading partners. The $1,300 per family cost is an average, which means some families would pay less and some would pay significantly more. Families in cold climates who depend on Canadian natural gas for heating would pay more. Families in regions where Canadian lumber is the primary building material would pay more. Families who drive cars with significant Canadian content would pay more when they purchase their next vehicle. The distribution of pain would not be equal or fair. If there's a silver lining to this looming crisis, it's that awareness is growing. More Americans are beginning to understand that tariffs aren't abstract policy debates, but concrete threats to their financial well-being. More business leaders are speaking out about the dangers. More economists are making the case against protectionism. More journalists are explaining the real costs of trade wars. Whether this growing awareness will translate into political pressure sufficient to change course remains uncertain. The path forward should be clear to anyone who looks at the evidence objectively. The United States and Canada should strengthen their economic partnership, not weaken it. Disputes should be resolved through negotiation and the mechanisms established in the USMCA, not through unilateral tariffs. Policies to support American workers should focus on education, training, infrastructure investment, and support for communities in transition, not on futile attempts to reverse globalization through tariffs. The goal should be to help American workers and businesses compete in the global economy, not to pretend that global economy can be wished away. The $1,300 tariff shock isn't inevitable. It's a choice. It's a policy decision that can be reconsidered, modified, or abandoned. But if it moves forward, American families need to understand what's coming. They need to understand that when their costs go up, it's not because of inflation in the traditional sense, not because of corporate greed, not because of some mysterious economic force. It's because their government chose to impose taxes on the goods they buy. It's because trade policy driven by politics rather than economics prioritizes simple messaging over complex reality. It's because the voices calling for economic nationalism have, at least for now, drowned out the voices calling for economic rationality. The Canada trade truth that the White House can't ignore, or at least shouldn't ignore, is that prosperity is built on cooperation, not confrontation. The American dream is about opportunity, upward mobility, the chance for a better life. That dream is harder to achieve when families are paying $1,300 more per year for basic necessities due to unnecessary tariffs. It's harder when jobs are lost in trade wars. It's harder when the economy grows more slowly because of self-inflicted wounds. The choice facing policymakers is whether to learn from history and economics or to repeat the mistakes of the past. For the sake of American families, for the sake of American prosperity, for the sake of the relationship with our closest neighbor and ally, let's hope wisdom prevails.